If an ordinary American somehow saved every single penny of a congressional salary, never bought groceries, never paid rent, never filled a gas tank, never paid an electric bill, and somehow survived without spending a dollar, it would still take roughly 1/400 years to accumulate 250 million. Nancy Pelosi, according to the figures laid out in this hearing, reached that level of wealth during 37 years in Congress, and that contrast was exactly where Senator John Kennedy decided to begin. He did not open with a speech about corruption, did not throw around accusations, and did not waste time decorating the argument with Washington language designed to hide what ordinary arithmetic already made uncomfortable. He came with a legal pad, a pen, and one basic question that sounded almost too simple for a room packed with cameras. Ma'am, where did the money go? The hearing room was already full before Pelosi arrived, the afternoon session underway, cameras positioned, staff moving around the edges, and the kind of expectation hanging over the chamber that usually appears when everyone knows the real fight will begin before the first answer is finished. Pelosi entered the way she had entered rooms like this for decades, chin raised, staff behind her, a leather folder under one arm, and reading glasses in hand, composed enough to make the entire scene look routine. She sat down, opened the folder, placed the glasses on, and settled into the chair with the calm of someone who had survived political ambushes, investigations, hostile interviews, and congressional warfare for most of her adult life. Kennedy was already waiting, without a stack of briefing books, without aides whispering into his ear, without a mountain of prepared material covering the desk in front of him. He had a legal pad, a pen, and the patience of a man who had spent years dealing with numbers that were supposed to balance. Ma'am, I appreciate you being here today. I just have a few questions, simple ones about numbers. Pelosi adjusted her glasses and answered, "Of course, Senator." And Kennedy immediately went to the first line of the ledger rather than spending 5 minutes congratulating everybody in the room for showing up. He asked her annual salary as a member of Congress, and Pelosi gave the number every member receives, $174,000 a year. Kennedy wrote it down slowly, not because the number was difficult, but because the entire point of what followed depended on keeping the arithmetic painfully simple. Then he asked for her estimated net worth. Pelosi did not give him the number immediately, instead pointing out that her financial disclosures had been public for 37 years, which was true within the framework of the exchange, but did nothing to answer the question sitting directly in front of her. Kennedy made clear that he had read those disclosures and asked again, not for a document, not for a citation, but for the estimate stated into the microphone in front of the cameras. Pelosi finally answered that estimates varied and that some reports had placed the figure as high as $250 million. Kennedy wrote that number down too, then looked at the two figures sitting on the page as if they belonged in the same equation and had absolutely no intention of cooperating. One number represented congressional income and the other represented a fortune. Kennedy reminded Pelosi that he had served as Louisiana State Treasurer for 17 years, where every bond issue, every disbursement, and every dollar passing through the office eventually had to meet the same unforgiving requirement. The books had to add up. He explained that when they did not add up, somebody had to find out why, because numbers do not become respectable merely because powerful people are standing beside them. At $174,000 a year for 37 years, Pelosi's congressional salary would total roughly $6.4 million before taxes, expenses, housing, food, travel, and every other cost attached to living an actual human life. Yet the estimate sitting across from that income figure was more than $200 million, and, in some reports cited in the script, approximately $250 million. Kennedy did not need a dramatic accusation because the gap itself was already doing the work. He laid out the comparison in language that no accountant, lawyer, lobbyist, or communications advisor could bury under procedural fog. Even if someone saved every dollar of that congressional salary and somehow spent nothing at all, reaching $250 million would require roughly 400 years. Kennedy pushed the absurdity further by noting that 400 years ago, the Roman Empire was still falling, a comparison that turned an abstract wealth figure into something almost comically impossible to reconcile with salary alone. Then came the line about the government money tree, delivered with the controlled sarcasm that made the attack sharper precisely because Kennedy did not need to shout. Pelosi's expression tightened, and she answered with the explanation she had given before. Paul Pelosi was a venture capitalist. He had built financial leasing services, managed investments, backed companies, and created wealth through private business. Her husband's success, she argued, was not automatically her scandal. Pelosi then went on offense, pointing out that wealthy members existed on the Republican side as well, and asking whether Kennedy intended to investigate them with the same enthusiasm, or whether this particular exercise was aimed only at her. It was a politically intelligent counter because it shifted the question from her fortune to the possibility of partisan selectivity, forcing Kennedy to either defend his side or abandon the thread he had carefully built. Kennedy did neither because he acknowledged that Paul Pelosi could indeed be a talented investor and said he was not there to attack the existence of his business. That concession mattered because it stripped away the easiest defense, the claim that Kennedy was simply mocking private wealth or pretending successful investors did not exist. The next question was not whether Paul Pelosi invested, but how extraordinary the reported results had become. Kennedy turned the legal pad to a clean page and began reading figures from the household portfolio, starting with the claim that in 2024, the Pelosi portfolio returned approximately 70%, while the S&P 500 returned about 25%. That is not a modest outperformance, not a slightly better year, not the sort of margin that disappears after adjusting a few assumptions. Within the script's framing, it is a difference of roughly 46 percentage points. Kennedy then moved backward, saying the portfolio gained roughly 65% in 2023, while the broader market delivered about half that, and he pointed to similar patterns across 2021 and 2022. His argument was brutally simple. Successful investors beat the market sometimes, exceptional investors beat it more often, but a household that repeatedly crushes major indexes by enormous margins is going to attract questions no matter how many times the word coincidence gets polished for television. Ma'am, your household does not just beat the market, it laps it. Kennedy did not need to accuse Pelosi of personally choosing trades because he was attacking the statistical appearance of the results, not asking the room to accept a confession that had never been given. He said he had known smart investors, lucky investors, professionals who studied companies for a living and still got major decisions wrong because markets punish certainty and reward nobody forever. The best fund managers in the world can celebrate beating a benchmark by a few percentage points because doing even that consistently is difficult enough to build entire careers around. Against that background, Kennedy held up the reported Pelosi returns and reduced the entire argument to a line designed to stick because the arithmetic had already prepared the room for it. Ma'am, that is not investing. That is prophecy. The point landed because Kennedy was not presenting luck as impossible. He was presenting repeated, enormous outperformance as something that deserved scrutiny rather than applause. Pelosi answered that her husband's investment decisions were his own and that she had no prior knowledge and no subsequent involvement in his transactions, a position she said had been stated publicly and repeatedly. Kennedy did not claim that answer was a confession, and he did not invent one for her because he had another number waiting that would move the argument away from personal denial and toward the rules governing congressional disclosure. The salary had established the gap, the net worth estimate had established the scale, and the investment returns had established the pattern Kennedy wanted the audience to examine. The next number on the legal pad was 45 days. Kennedy leaned into the next number because 45 days was not merely a technical deadline buried in congressional paperwork. In his argument, it was the space where visibility disappeared, and ordinary people were forced to wait while the people making national policy already knew exactly what had happened inside their own households. The Stock Act requires members of Congress to disclose certain trades within 45 days, and Kennedy emphasized the practical meaning of that rule rather than dressing it up in legal terminology. For as long as 6.5 weeks, the public may not know what a congressional household has just bought or sold, even while legislation, committee activity, regulatory pressure, and federal spending continue moving through Washington. Kennedy did not present that delay as proof of wrongdoing by itself, and he did not need to, because his point was that the structure creates a period of darkness large enough to invite suspicion whenever trades line up unusually well with public action. In Louisiana terms, he compared it to a man buying land and discovering 44 days later that the government was building a highway beside it, because at some point even people who hate conspiracy theories start asking whether the calendar deserves a closer look. Pelosi stayed with the same defense, that her husband made his own investment decisions and that she did not direct his trades, while Kennedy kept the focus on the system rather than pretending he had proved a private conversation he could not see. The structure of his case depended on refusing to overreach, because an accusation that could be dismissed would only help Pelosi, while a sequence of disclosed trades and public legislative events could be read directly from the record he was citing. Kennedy's line was that 45 days mattered because disclosure arriving after the fact does not tell the public what members and their families knew, believed, or expected at the moment money moved. He tapped the legal pad and returned to the pattern, saying that in the Pelosi household, the money seemed to move in the right direction with a frequency that demanded explanation. Then he turned the page again, and the hearing shifted from general rules to specific timing. Ma'am, let's talk about timing. Kennedy moved first to November 2023 when, according to the script, Paul Pelosi purchased 50 call options in Nvidia, a position Kennedy described in simple terms for viewers who did not spend their lives around trading desks. A call option is a wager on a stock rising, and 50 contracts on one company represented, in Kennedy's framing, a serious position rather than casual speculation. He then connected that trade to the semiconductor industry and to federal policy, arguing that the timing became politically combustible because Congress was moving major legislation involving enormous government support for chip manufacturing. Pelosi immediately answered the obvious objection that Nvidia was one of the largest companies in the world and that millions of investors could reach bullish conclusions about it without receiving anything from the Speaker of the House. That response was strong because the existence of public legislation is not a secret. The semiconductor debate had been widely covered, and a successful trade is not automatically evidence that somebody possessed prohibited information. Kennedy accepted the public nature of the legislation but narrowed the issue again, arguing that Pelosi had enormous influence over the House floor schedule and therefore occupied a position where timing was not merely something she watched from outside. In the script's framing, his argument was not that buying Nvidia proved a crime, but that a household trade placed before major legislative action looked different when one member of that household controlled when House business came to the floor. He said Paul Pelosi had not simply bet on Nvidia, he had bet on timing, and Kennedy told Pelosi that the timing belonged to her. Pelosi called the insinuation outrageous, but Kennedy's answer was equally controlled. He said he was not inventing an insinuation, he was reading the family's disclosure forms aloud. That distinction became the engine of the entire section, because Kennedy repeatedly refused to claim access to hidden evidence, and instead used public timing as a weapon. He moved from Nvidia to other transactions mentioned in the script, including Visa stocks sold before an antitrust lawsuit and Alphabet calls bought before committee activity, presenting them as part of a broader sequence rather than isolated financial decisions. Trade after trade, he argued, appeared to land near political or regulatory developments, and every additional example made the coincidence defense more expensive because coincidence works best when it does not have to explain a pattern. Kennedy finally delivered the line that compressed the argument into something every viewer could understand. If he were a gambling man, he would want Paul Pelosi's calendar. The joke worked because it was not really about gambling, it was about access to timing. Pelosi's posture hardened, but she did not retreat from her broader response. She reminded Kennedy that she had heard these accusations for years from reporters, commentators, and political opponents and had survived every version of the same charge. Then she offered what was probably her strongest substantive counter in this part of the exchange. She said she had changed her position and now supported banning stock trading by members of Congress and their families. She pointed to her vote for the Stop Insider Trading Act and argued that if Kennedy believed the system was broken, then her support for changing that system should count for something. She also challenged him to apply the same standard to Republicans who traded heavily while serving on committees connected to industries in which they invested. That counter forced the argument out of personality and back into principle, because if congressional trading was a systemic problem, then focusing only on Pelosi would be incomplete. Kennedy acknowledged the point instead of pretending no Republicans had money in the market, and he gave Pelosi credit for supporting the ban. Then he attacked the timing of the reform itself, saying she supported it only after decades in office and after the household fortune had already grown dramatically. In the script, he framed the sequence as someone benefiting from a system for years and then helping lock the door after the wealth had already been accumulated. His line about a man robbing a bank every Tuesday for 20 years and then voting to outlaw bank robbery on Wednesday was deliberately brutal because it transformed a legislative vote that Pelosi presented as reform into evidence, in Kennedy's argument, that reform had arrived after the profitable years were already behind her. Kennedy followed that with the claim that the Pelosi household had turned roughly $30 million into approximately $278 million before supporting a rule designed to stop members and their families from continuing similar trading activity. Again, the pressure came from sequencing. First the accumulation, then the restriction. First the open door, then the vote to close it. Kennedy called that retirement rather than reform, not because the law itself was meaningless, but because, in his framing, it arrived after the people already positioned to benefit had enjoyed decades under the old system. Pelosi had tried to turn the hearing toward bipartisan congressional behavior, but Kennedy kept pulling it back toward the one question he had placed on the table at the beginning. How did the money grow so fast, and why did the timing look so consistently favorable? Then Kennedy introduced another symbol of the same problem, the so-called Pelosi Tracker, apps and online services built around following disclosed trades associated with Paul Pelosi and copying them after the information became public. According to the script, retail investors who copied those filings in 2025 earned returns of 72%, a figure Kennedy used not as a technical market study, but as a piece of political theater sharpened by numbers. Strangers on the internet, he said, were effectively copying Paul Pelosi's homework and getting A's, which made the household's track record sound less like ordinary portfolio management and more like a public signal powerful enough to become its own strategy. Pelosi had arrived with a folder full of prepared material, but by this stage, the prepared statement was becoming irrelevant because Kennedy was not allowing the hearing to drift into generalities. He was building a calendar. The House floor schedule, the company names, the disclosure dates, the legislative windows, the returns, the eventual support for a trading ban, and the existence of retail trackers all became pieces of the same argument. Kennedy summarized it in the bluntest terms available to him. Pelosi controlled the House floor schedule, Her family invested in companies that could benefit from legislation. Those companies rose, and the family profited. He allowed that Pelosi could call it coincidence and could insist on independence between her political work and her husband's investing because he was not pretending the hearing had produced a criminal confession. But where Kennedy came from, he said they called it a calendar. Then he turned the page and made clear that the timing, damaging as he had made it sound, was not even the worst part. Kennedy moved from trading to spending because, in the structure of his argument, a ledger has two sides, and he had already spent enough time on the side where money came in. The salary did not explain the fortune. The investment returns appeared wildly stronger than the market, and the timing of the trades had become the central pressure point of the hearing. But Kennedy now wanted to move to the other side of the book, the side where government money moved out. He set the legal pad down, picked it up again, then opened a new section and said, "Ma'am, let's talk about spending." Pelosi removed the reading glasses from her forehead, folded them, and placed them beside the open folder that had been sitting in front of her since the beginning. The prepared statement remained there, but Kennedy had long since dragged the hearing away from anything that could be answered by reading a polished paragraph prepared in advance. Pelosi answered that she had overseen some of the most significant legislation in modern American history and was prepared to discuss it, and Kennedy immediately began with the HEROES Act. He cited the $3 trillion price tag and reminded the room that Pelosi introduced it in May 2020 during the worst period of the pandemic, when Congress was under enormous pressure to spend quickly and on a scale almost unimaginable under ordinary circumstances. Pelosi defended the legislation as relief for families, state and local governments, unemployment assistance, small businesses, testing, contact tracing, and the other emergency measures supporters argued the country needed in a crisis. Kennedy did not deny that those categories were inside the bill, because denying obvious emergency spending would have weakened the argument he was trying to build. Instead, he narrowed the focus again and began reading the additional provisions that made the package politically vulnerable. He pointed to stimulus payments for undocumented immigrants, permanent nationwide mail-in voting, and then to a Silicon Valley subway extension connected to Pelosi's district. Kennedy's criticism was not that every dollar in the bill was illegitimate, because he had already conceded that the pandemic created genuine need, but that emergency legislation had become a vehicle large enough to carry priorities that looked very different from direct survival aid. "You put a subway in your own backyard inside a pandemic relief bill, ma'am," he said, putting the contrast where it could not be hidden behind a $1 trillion headline. Families were standing in food bank lines. Businesses were closing. Workers were wondering how long savings would last, and Kennedy's argument was that Washington still managed to find room for projects that benefited powerful districts. The bigger the bill became, the easier it was for those details to disappear inside the scale. Pelosi pushed back hard because this was the part of the hearing where she could argue not only from policy, but from crisis. She reminded Kennedy that COVID had been the worst national emergency in a generation, that federal officials had urged Congress to think big, that relief checks went to families who could not buy groceries, that vaccines were funded, and that small businesses were kept alive by federal spending. She challenged Kennedy directly by asking whether he would have preferred that Congress do nothing, forcing him to confront the emotional reality behind the numbers rather than speaking as if $3 trillion had been spent in a vacuum. The response mattered because nobody watching the hearing needed to be told that millions of Americans had needed help. Kennedy understood that, accepted it, and then went after the contradiction he believed was harder to defend. He said nobody was claiming the pandemic was fake, and nobody was claiming Americans did not need assistance, then moved directly to the Paycheck Protection Program replenishment. According to the script, Pelosi's side blocked a $250 billion replenishment for small businesses on a Thursday, and Kennedy emphasized the day because he wanted the next detail to land beside it, not somewhere in the vague timeline of 2020. The next day, Friday, Pelosi appeared on late night television from her San Francisco kitchen and opened a freezer Kennedy described as costing $24,000. Inside were rows of premium ice cream priced at roughly $13 a pint, and Pelosi smiled into the camera and said she did not know what she would have done if ice cream had not been invented. Kennedy did not need to claim that the freezer caused anyone's hardship. He used the image as a symbol of the distance between the people writing shutdown policy and the people living under its consequences. That contrast became more aggressive as Kennedy described ordinary workers in Louisiana trying to survive closed businesses while the Speaker of the House appeared on television beside a freezer worth more than some families earned in a year. He asked what a hairdresser in Madisonville might have been eating that Friday while her shop was closed, and what a body shop owner in Baton Rouge might have been feeding his children while his business was shut down. The point was not really chocolate versus vanilla, and it was not even the price of the appliance by itself. It was the political blindness Kennedy believed the moment represented. Pelosi had chosen the kitchen, chosen the television appearance, opened the freezer, and delivered a line about expensive ice cream while people across the country were calculating rent, groceries, and missed paychecks. Kennedy then invoked the nickname Nancy Antoinette, using it as shorthand for the accusation that elite comfort had become so normal that the people inside it could no longer understand why everyone outside it was furious. Pelosi rejected that characterization and insisted she had fought for working families throughout her career, but Kennedy did not leave the subject there. He shifted from the freezer to September 2020 and the San Francisco hair salon incident, another moment in the script where the criticism centered less on the existence of a rule than on whether the person defending the rule was expected to live under it. Pelosi went into a salon that was closed under lockdown restrictions she publicly supported, had her hair washed and blown out, and appeared without a mask inside the business. Kennedy said he did not begrudge anyone a haircut, and even joked that he needed one himself half the time, but the joke did not soften the point. The business was supposed to be closed, and Pelosi entered anyway. When security footage became public, Kennedy reminded Pelosi that she said she had been set up and that the salon owed her an apology. That response became the real target because it shifted responsibility away from the powerful official who entered the closed business and toward the business owner whose cameras recorded what happened. Kennedy identified the owner as Erica Cuse, a single mother with 2 children, and said she had been traveling when the incident occurred, that the cameras had been operating normally, and that after the footage went public, she received death threats, closed the business, and eventually relocated. He paused over the fact that Pelosi had demanded an apology, because in Kennedy's framing, that was the moment when privilege stopped looking accidental. The person with power broke the rule. The person without power suffered the consequences, and somehow the apology was expected to travel upward. Kennedy then added the final layer of the salon episode by pointing to Pelosi's appearance on MSNBC later that same evening. Hours after the footage became public, she criticized the president for not wearing a mask and for failing to follow the science, creating exactly the kind of contradiction Kennedy had been collecting throughout the hearing. The problem was no longer only the salon visit, it was the ability to step out of one standard and immediately lecture the rest of the country about obedience to that same standard. By this point, Pelosi's reading glasses remained folded on the table beside an open folder she had barely used, and the visual itself matched the structure of the hearing. She had arrived prepared to read answers, but Kennedy was forcing her to sit inside a sequence of facts that did not fit neatly into prepared language. Kennedy finally closed the legal pad and told Pelosi he had one more question before explaining what all of it added up to. The ledger was almost complete now, at least in the argument he had spent the hearing constructing, a congressional salary that did not come close to explaining the fortune, investment returns that repeatedly beat the broader market by enormous margins, trades that appeared close to important legislative and regulatory developments, trillion-dollar spending packages containing district-specific priorities, the freezer during a small business crisis, and the salon during rules ordinary people were told they could not ignore. None of those episodes taken alone was the whole case Kennedy wanted the audience to see. He had been stacking them precisely so the conclusion would not depend on a single trade, a single television appearance, or a single mistake. The next page was where he intended to stop counting individual lines and tell Pelosi what he believed the entire ledger showed. Kennedy opened the legal pad to a blank page, held it where the room could see the empty paper, and for the first time stopped treating the hearing as a collection of separate transactions, separate votes, separate television clips, and separate explanations. "Ma'am, I have been sitting here for about 40 minutes, and I want to tell you what I see," he said, because the point of the previous pages had never been merely to produce a pile of uncomfortable facts. The salary was one line, the investment returns another, the trading calendar another, the spending another, and each had arrived with its own defense ready before Kennedy even finished asking the question. Pelosi could say her husband was a gifted investor. She could say legislative developments were public. She could say pandemic spending was necessary. And she could say individual incidents had been distorted by political enemies. Kennedy's argument was that those explanations looked considerably weaker when all the lines were placed on the same page and every arrow seemed to point in the same direction. "What I see is not a series of coincidences. What I see is a machine." Kennedy did not need to shout the word, because the previous 40 minutes had already supplied the parts he believed made the machine recognizable. Wealth that congressional salary could never explain, extraordinary investment performance, trades appearing near consequential government action, and massive spending decisions flowing through a political structure Pelosi had helped command for decades. Separately, he admitted, every component could be defended, rationalized, compartmentalized, and assigned a respectable Washington explanation. Together, however, Kennedy said the pattern stopped looking random and started looking constructed. "But ma'am, when all three point in the same direction for 37 years, that is not luck. That is architecture." That was the sharpest shift in the hearing, because Kennedy was no longer asking Pelosi to explain one transaction or one public embarrassment. He was accusing the entire pattern of having a design. He returned to the House floor schedule, the legislation, the companies that stood to benefit, the household investments, the profits that followed, and the enormous federal spending measures that contained provisions affecting Pelosi's own district. His language stayed deliberately simple because technical language would only give the argument somewhere to hide, while words like machine and architecture forced the audience to visualize a system that had been assembled piece by piece. Machines do not operate because everybody standing nearby happens to be lucky at the same time. Someone builds them, someone maintains them, and somebody receives the benefit when they keep running. Kennedy looked directly at Pelosi and argued that after 37 years, the person benefiting most from the machine was sitting across from him. For the first time in the hearing, as described in the script, Pelosi's eyes dropped toward the table rather than staying fixed on Kennedy. The open folder was still there. The reading glasses were folded beside it, and the prepared statement that had arrived ready for a conventional political hearing had become almost irrelevant to what was happening. When Pelosi finally answered, she did not return immediately to Nvidia, the Stock Act, the freezer, or the salon, because Kennedy had widened the confrontation beyond any one fact she could rebut. She spoke instead about the weight of her career, becoming the first woman to serve as Speaker of the House, helping pass the Affordable Care Act, leading legislative responses to a financial crisis and a pandemic, and spending 37 years fighting political battles she believed mattered to American families. Her objection was emotional but unmistakable. Kennedy was taking an entire lifetime in public office and reducing it to numbers on a spreadsheet. Kennedy did not mock that answer because doing so would have weakened him, and he did not pretend that Pelosi's historic offices or legislative achievements had never existed. "Ma'am, I have never questioned your title. I have never questioned your power. I have never questioned your service, he told her, granting the career before cutting directly back to the only battlefield he had chosen from the beginning. I am questioning your math. The distinction was devastating within the script's argument because honors, titles, elections, committee victories, and legislative accomplishments do not change arithmetic when the subject is money. 37 years of political importance could explain influence, but Kennedy was insisting that influence was not the same thing as an explanation for wealth exceeding $200 million. He reminded the room again that he had spent 17 years as Louisiana State Treasurer counting other people's money under rules that did not care about reputation. Every dollar coming into an account had to correspond with a dollar going somewhere every ledger needed to reconcile, and missing information could not be repaired by listing unrelated achievements at the bottom of the page. That was why Kennedy's background mattered more than the jokes and more than the accent, because his central political weapon in this hearing was the claim that he recognized what a clean set of books was supposed to look like. I know what a clean ledger looks like, he told Pelosi. And ma'am, yours has pages missing. Then Kennedy reached the last question, the one the entire script had been moving toward from the first salary calculation. If Paul Pelosi was completely independent in his investment activity, Kennedy asked why his trades appeared under Nancy Pelosi's name on the financial disclosure forms required under the rules governing members of Congress. Pelosi opened her mouth, but in the script, no answer came before Kennedy allowed the silence itself to become part of the exchange. 3 seconds, then 5, with the room effectively counting alongside him, because after pages of numbers, there was nothing complicated left about the question he wanted remembered. Ma'am, where did the money go? By that point, the phrase no longer functioned as a request for one missing transaction, because Kennedy had used the entire hearing to turn it into a judgment on the system he believed the numbers exposed. He had not built his case around a confession from Pelosi, and he had not needed her to admit that she gave her husband inside information, because no such admission existed in the source, and Kennedy's argument had deliberately avoided depending on one. What he presented instead was a chain of contrasts: public salary against private fortune, ordinary market performance against extraordinary returns, public disclosure against a 45-day delay, emergency hardship against elite comfort, and rules imposed on ordinary citizens against moments when the person defending those rules appeared exempt from their consequences. The hearing therefore ended not with Kennedy producing a secret recording or a hidden bank account, but with him putting the disclosed pieces together and insisting that the pattern itself was the scandal. The legal pad had done what political speeches usually fail to do. It had taken years of separate controversies and forced them onto one ledger. The broader conclusion of the script then moved beyond Pelosi herself, because congressional stock trading was never presented as a problem belonging only to one party or one politician. Members of Congress from both parties have held substantial investments in industries affected by the committees, legislation, regulation, and spending decisions of the federal government, and Pelosi became the central figure here because Kennedy's questioning used her wealth and household trading record as the most visible example of the system under attack. The argument was not merely that a politician became rich, but that the rules had allowed lawmakers and their families to participate in markets, while simultaneously occupying positions unavailable to ordinary investors. The proposed trading restrictions mattered precisely because they acknowledged the conflict that had generated public suspicion for years, but Kennedy's attack was that reform arriving after decades of opportunity did not erase what came before it. In that sense, the machine was larger than Pelosi, and the hearing's final accusation was that Washington had normalized a structure the public would never tolerate anywhere else. That was also why the freezer and the salon mattered in the closing interpretation, even though neither incident could explain an investment portfolio. They illustrated the distance Kennedy believed had grown between long-serving political power and ordinary life, a distance so wide that what looked outrageous from a kitchen table could look completely normal from inside Washington. The expensive ice cream became politically poisonous, not because wealthy people are forbidden from buying ice cream, but because the image appeared while businesses and families were being crushed by restrictions and uncertainty. The salon incident became more damaging not simply because Pelosi entered the business, but because her response suggested that the person enforcing the rules could see herself as the victim when those rules caught up with her. In Kennedy's framing, that was the real balance at the bottom of the ledger. Not merely money, but power so insulated from ordinary consequences that ordinary questions eventually sounded like insults. The cameras cut, the room emptied, and the folder that Pelosi had carried into the hearing remained beside the reading glasses that had stopped serving any purpose long before the final question. She had arrived prepared to read from organized pages, but Kennedy's method was to read the public record back at her, one number and one date at a time, until the prepared answers no longer controlled the direction of the room. His advantage was not that he had uncovered a new secret in those 40 minutes, but that he had taken information people had seen in fragments and forced it into a single arithmetic argument that political rhetoric could not easily dissolve. Reporters can be dismissed as partisan, commentators can be ignored as entertainers, and opponents can be accused of pursuing grudges, but an audit attacks from a colder direction because the numbers remain even after everyone stops talking. Kennedy's final message was therefore as simple as the first line on his legal pad. The money always talks, but somebody still has to count it.